End quote. Your grandfather was nothing but a squatter, a placeholder for progress, and it and Oppos. It's time you handed over the keys before things get ugly. End quote. That's what Meredith Vane screamed at me, right there in the middle of Oak Ridge Cemetery, while my grandfather's casket was still hovering over the open earth. The smell of damp Georgia clay and funeral lilies was thick in the air, and this woman, dressed in a white Chanel suit that probably cost more than my first car, was pointing a manicured finger at my chest like she was an empress demanding a tribute. She didn't care about the service. She didn't care about the veterans in dress blues standing at attention. She only cared about the 850 acres of pristine, rolling timberland and black soil farm that my grandfather, Silas Thorne, had spent 50 years bleeding for. I'm Leo, by the way, 32, a guy who spent the last decade in a glass office in Seattle doing cybersecurity, thinking my biggest problem was a slow server until I inherited a small kingdom and a target on my back. Silas was a different breed of man, a guy who survived the Mekong Delta and came back with a purple heart and a silence that lasted until he stepped onto this dirt, and he raised me after my parents and Oppos. Plane went down when I was 10, teaching me that land ISN and Oppos. T just something you own, it and Oppos, as a living thing you protect. But to Meredith, the self-appointed queen of the end quote, Stonegate Heights end quote, Homeowners Association, our family farm was just a end quote, blemish end quote, on her suburban masterpiece, a wasted space that she'd already promised to a group of developers for a gated golf community called the Sovereignty. She thought she could bully a city kid, someone she viewed as soft and grief-stricken, but what she didn't realize was that Silas Thorne didn't end Oppos. T just leave me a farm. He left me a tactical roadmap and a legal fortress that would eventually bury her entire world. The first week after the funeral was a blur of dust and ghosts. Me sitting in that old kitchen where the air always smelled like chicory coffee and gun oil, try to make sense of the maps spread across the oak table. And that's when the first blow landed, a formal notice from the county, hand-delivered by a deputy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Meredith had filed a end quote, cloud on title end quote, claim, alleging that Silas's original land grant was defective and that the will was signed under end quote, undue influence end quote. And just like that, the $4 million estate was frozen, my bank accounts were flagged, and I couldn't in Oppos to even sell a single cord of wood to pay the property taxes. I remember sitting on the porch that night, watching the lights of Stonegate Heights, those oversized, soulless McMansions, twinkling on the ridge like predatory eyes, and I could almost hear Meredith's laugh, that sharp, crystalline sound of a woman who's used to getting exactly what she wants by breaking people who don in Oppos. T have the stomach for a fight. But Silas had a saying, end quote, patience is a weapon, Leo. Use it to let the enemy trip over their own shadow, end quote. So I didn't in Oppos. T call a lawyer right away. Instead, I went to the local diner, a place where the grease is thick and the gossip is thicker, and I just listened. I met Evelyn, the town's retired librarian who'd known Silas since the 50s, and over a slice of blueberry pie, she whispered that Meredith had been, end quote, researching, end quote, our property lines for months on the public computers, leaving behind a trail of search history that included things like, end quote, adverse possession, end quote, and, end quote, eminent domain for private utility, end quote. Then there was Miller, who ran the local hardware store, who told me Meredith had been buying up industrial grade, and, quote, no trespassing, end quote, signs and surveyor stakes by the pallet, all on the HOA's dime, and that's when I realized this wasn't Oppos. T just a land grab. It was a coordinated siege. I decided to play the part of the overwhelmed city boy, letting my beard grow out, walking around with a confused look on my face, while I secretly spent my nights digging through Silas's old military trunks in the attic. And that's where I found it, a dented metal canister tucked inside his old field jacket. Inside wasn't an Oppos, T a map or a deed, but a faded, handwritten document from 1974, a, end quote, permanent conservation easement and agricultural covenant, end quote, signed by the previous governor and 3 county commissioners, and as I read the fine print, I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the night air. The covenant stated that if any portion of the Thorne farm was ever rezoned for non-agricultural use, even if the owner agreed to it, The entire property would automatically and irrevocably forfeit to the state and Oppo's Wildlife Preservation Bureau, and the person who initiated the rezoning would be liable for, and quote, restoration damages, and quote, equal to 3 times the land and Oppo's market value. Silas hadn't and Oppo's just protected the land. He turned it into a landmine for anyone greedy enough to try and quote, develop, and quote. I knew Meredith had already pre-sold 5, and quote, platinum estates, and quote, on my land to wealthy investors from Atlanta, taking their deposits to fund her lifestyle and the HOA's legal war against me. So I decided to give her exactly what she wanted, or at least the illusion of it. I, end quote, accidentally, end quote, left a draft of a rezoning application on the dashboard of my truck while I was parked at the courthouse, knowing her spy, the HOA secretary, would see it, and within 48 hours, Meredith was at my gate, her pink Cadillac idling like a purring beast, and she had this look of absolute triumph on her face. End quote. I knew you'd see reason, Leo, end quote, she said, her voice dripping with fake honey as she handed me a, end quote, settlement agreement, end quote, that would give her the development rights for pennies on the dollar, end quote. This land is too big for a boy like you. Let us professionals handle the burden, end quote. I looked her right in the eyes, pretending to be broken, and I told her I'd consider it if she could prove the HOA had the, end quote, environmental clearance, end quote, to take over the creekside acreage. That was the bait, and she hit it like a shark because she spent the next month filing every permit, every rezoning request, and every environmental, end quote, correction, end quote, she could think of, essentially doing all the legwork to prove her, end quote, intent to develop, end quote, in a public record. Meanwhile, I'd hired a private investigator, a guy named Vance who looked like a board accountant but could find a needle in a haystack of offshore accounts. And what he found was the finishing touch. Meredith wasn't an Oppo's just a bully. She was a fraud. Her real name was Sandra Miller. She'd been barred from the real estate board in 3 different states for embezzlement, and she'd been using Stonegate Heights HOA fees as her personal piggy bank to cover her failed investments in a luxury spa that never opened. The final showdown happened at the County Planning Commission meeting, a room packed with Stonegate residents and Meredith's, end quote, investors, end quote, all of them smelling blood in the water as the board prepared to vote on her rezoning application. Meredith stood at the podium, looking like a queen about to be crowned, giving this long, winding speech about, end quote, progress, end quote, and, end quote, cleaning up the thorn eyesore, end quote. And when it was my turn to speak, I didn't an Oppo's bring a lawyer. I just brought a folder and a laptop. I projected Silas's 1974 covenant onto the big screen, and the room went silent, a heavy, suffocating kind of silence, as I explained that by filing these rezoning requests, Meredith had just triggered the state's, end quote, automatic reversion, end quote, clause. I watched the color drain from her face, turning her expensive foundation into a gray mask, as I pointed out that the 850 acres were now, as of 5 minutes ago, a protected state wildlife sanctuary that could never, ever be built upon. And because she was the one who signed the applications, she was now legally responsible for the $12 million in, end quote, restoration penalties, end quote, owed to the state. But I wasn't Oppo's done, because I then played the audio Vance had recorded, the, end quote, utility crews, end quote, she'd sent onto my land were actually her brother-in-law and his buddies, caught on tape talking about, end quote, salting the well, end quote, with old motor oil to force an environmental shutdown, so I and Oppo's be forced to sell. The, end quote, investors, end quote, in the front row started standing up, their faces turning a shade of red that matched Meredith's lipstick, realizing their deposits were gone, and they were tied to a woman who was about to be investigated for felony fraud and environmental terrorism. Meredith tried to scream. She tried to claim it was all a setup, but the sheriff was already standing at the back of the room with a set of cuffs. And, as she was let out, her heels clicking frantically on the linoleum, she looked at me with a hatred so pure it felt like heat. I still live in that old farmhouse, and the only, end quote, progress, end quote, you'll find on the Thornland these days is the sound of the wind through the timber and the deer coming down to the creek at dusk. And Stonegate Heights? Well, the HOA call, apsed under the weight of the lawsuits, the, end quote, luxury, end quote, Houses are losing their value now that they and Oppos, re-surrounded by a state-protected forest instead of a golf course, and Meredith is currently serving 6 years for fraud and, quote, malicious destruction of heritage property. And, quote, sometimes when I'm sitting on that porch swing, I can almost feel Silas sitting there next to me, smoking that old pipe and laughing at how the world thinks it's so smart, only to be outplayed by a man who knew how to wait. But it makes me wonder, in a world where everyone's trying to, in quote, develop, in quote, or in quote, flip, in quote, something for a quick buck, is there anything actually left that's worth more than the dirt it's built on? Or are we all just squatters, waiting for the real owner to come home and kick us off the lawn? Let me know what you think in the comments. Did I go too far by letting her destroy herself? Or did she get exactly what she deserved for trying to erase a veteran's legacy? Hit that like button and subscribe if you think the land should stay with the people who actually love it.